The bank records don't lie. The gavel had not even fallen yet, and already Grace Bennet could not look at her father. "Order in the court," Judge Eleanor Voss said, though her voice barely rose above the murmur rippling through the gallery of the Multnomah County Courthouse. "We are here on the matter of Bennett Timber and Steel versus Walter Bennett, on charges of embezzlement, wire fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty in the amount of $4.2 million. $4.2 million. Grace sat at the plaintiff's table in a charcoal grey suit that had once belonged to her mother, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone white. 61 years old, and Walter Bennett sat only 12 feet away from her, at the defendant's table, wearing the same brown tweed jacket he'd worn to her wedding 28 years ago. He did not look like a man who had stolen $4 million. He looked like a man who had lost his daughter, and was trying very hard not to let anyone see it. "Your Honor," said Grace's attorney, a sharp, precise woman named Denise Alvarez, rising to her feet. "The plaintiff intends to show that the defendant, as majority shareholder and founding partner of Bennett Timber and Steel, systematically diverted company funds into personal accounts over a period of 14 months, funds that were meant to cover payroll, pension obligations, and vendor contracts for over 200 employees." A murmur ran through the gallery. Somewhere behind Grace, an elderly woman, one of the retired mill workers who still trusted Walter Bennett with her pension, let out a small, wounded gasp. Walter Bennett did not flinch. He simply turned his head, slowly, and looked at his daughter for the first time since the case had begun. "Grace," he said quietly. Not loud enough for the judge to reprimand him, just loud enough for her to hear. She did not answer him, because 6 weeks earlier, Grace Bennett had been the one who found the wire transfers, and Grace Bennett was the one who had called the lawyers. 3 months before that morning in court, Grace had been running quarterly numbers in the same office her father built in 1994. Bennett Timber and Steel wasn't glamorous. It was sawdust and steel beams, and men who'd worked the same machines for 30 years. It was hers now. Mostly she'd taken over as chief operating officer 4 years earlier, after her mother's death, when her father, grieving and exhausted, had quietly stepped back. That was the story everyone believed. What Grace didn't know yet was that her father had never really let go. He'd just stopped telling her what he was doing. The first crack came fast. $11,000 missing from a vendor account. Grace asked the bookkeeper, a nervous young man named Peter Doyle, to look into it. 2 days later, Peter Doyle didn't come to work. He didn't answer his phone. His apartment in Beaverton was empty, half his furniture left behind. Grace didn't know it yet, but Daniel Cross had paid Peter Doyle $4,000 in cash to walk away quietly and say nothing about the account he'd flagged. It would be months before that fact ever reached her, and by then, it would explain a great deal. The second crack came a week later, a full forensic audit 18 months back. Her outside accountant called at 11 at night. Grace sat at her kitchen table and read the numbers with her hands shaking. $4.2 million, transferred in 11 separate withdrawals, each one authorized with her father's digital signature. She had sat there for a long time, staring at that number, thinking about the year her father had seemed different, distracted, quiet at Sunday dinners, disappearing for long drives on weekday afternoons that he never explained. She had thought it was grief. She had thought it was age catching up with him. She had never once thought it was theft. "The plaintiff calls its first witness," Denise Alvarez announced. "Marcus Lynn, forensic accountant." Marcus Lynn took the stand in a grey suit, carrying a leather folder thick with printouts. He'd spent 6 weeks combing through Bennett Timber and Steel's financial records, and his testimony landed like a series of small explosions. Mr. Lin, Alvarez began, can you describe what you found when you examined the company's outgoing wire transfers between March of last year and this past spring? I found a pattern, Lin said. 11 wire transfers, ranging from $200,000 to just over $600,000 each, all authorized using login credentials belonging to Walter Bennett. All 11 transfers were routed to the same offshore holding account, registered in the Cayman Islands under a shell corporation called Meridian Point Holdings. The gallery buzzed. Grace kept her eyes fixed on the table in front of her, refusing to look at her father, refusing to let herself feel anything until the case was finished. And in your professional opinion, Alvarez continued, who authorized these transfers? Based on the login credentials and the digital signature on each authorization form, Lin said, the transfers were authorized by Walter Bennett. Alvarez let the silence sit. Then, nothing further, Your Honor. Judge Voss turned toward the defense table. Cross-examination? Walter Bennett's attorney was a soft-spoken man in his 50s named Harold Voss, no relation to the judge, a coincidence that had caused some confusion during jury selection, and he rose slowly, buttoning his jacket. Mr. Lin, Harold said, you said the transfers were authorized using Walter Bennett's login credentials. Is that the same as saying Walter Bennett personally typed in those credentials? Lin hesitated. Not necessarily, no. So it's possible someone else had access to those credentials. It's possible, Lin admitted, though unlikely given the security protocols in place. Security protocols that were, in fact, managed by the company's chief financial officer, isn't that right? That's correct. And who was the chief financial officer of Bennett Timber and Steel during this period? Lin flipped through his folder. A man named Daniel Cross. Grace's stomach turned over. Daniel Cross had been her mother's protégé. He'd started as an intern 19 years ago, worked his way up through the company, and become the man Grace trusted most in the building after her father stepped back. Daniel Cross had sat across from her at budget meetings every single week for 4 years. Daniel Cross had comforted her at her mother's funeral. Daniel Cross was sitting 3 rows back in the gallery at that very moment, in a navy suit, his face carefully neutral. No further questions, Harold Voss said, sitting down. Judge Voss looked at the clock. We'll recess for 15 minutes. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Grace found her father standing alone near a window, looking out over the parking lot. He looked older than she remembered, grayer, thinner in the shoulders. You didn't have to bring in Lin, Walter said, without turning around. I know what he found. I know what it looks like. Then tell me what it actually is, Grace said, her voice cracking despite every effort to keep it steady. Because right now, Dad, it looks like you stole $4 million from people who trusted you. People who worked the line for 30 years. People whose pensions are gone. Walter turned to face her. There were tears in his eyes, but his jaw was set, the same stubborn set she'd inherited from him. I never touched a cent of that money for myself, he said. Not $1. Then where did it go? He looked at her for a long moment. Something behind his eyes seemed to be fighting itself. Some old, exhausted war between wanting to protect her and wanting, finally, to stop lying. I can't tell you yet, he said, but I promise you, Gracie, when this is over, you'll understand why I let you believe the worst about me. She stared at him. You let me believe it. You could have stopped this before it ever reached a courtroom. No, he said quietly. I couldn't. Before she could ask what that meant, the bailiff called them back inside. The defense's first witness was a surprise to almost everyone in the courtroom, including, it seemed, to Daniel Cross. "The defense calls Rita Alvarado," Harold Voss announced, branch manager at Cascade Pacific Bank. A woman in her 40s, sharply dressed, walked to the stand and was sworn in. Grace glanced at Denise Alvarez, whose expression had shifted from confidence to something more guarded. "Ms. Alvarado," Harold began, "you were subpoenaed to bring the complete account records for Meridian Point Holdings, is that correct?" "Yes." "And what did those records show regarding who had signing authority on that account?" Rita Alvarado opened a folder. "The account was opened 18 months ago. The listed authorized signer was Walter Bennett. However," she paused, glancing at the gallery, "the account also had a secondary authorized user added 4 months after opening. That user was granted full transfer authority." "And who was that secondary user?" "Daniel Cross." The gallery erupted into whispers, loud enough that Judge Voss struck her gavel twice. "Order, order, or I will clear this room." Grace's eyes shot to Daniel Cross. He was gripping the armrest of his seat, his knuckles bone white, his face draining of color. "Ms. Alvarado," Harold continued once the room quieted, "can you tell the court where the money in the Meridian Point account went after each transfer arrived?" "Within 72 hours of each deposit," Alvarado said, "the funds were withdrawn in structured amounts and transferred to a personal account in the name of Daniel Cross at a separate financial institution in Seattle." Grace felt the floor tilt beneath her. "Objection," Alvarez said quickly, rising. "Your Honor, this witness's testimony was not fully disclosed in pre-trial discovery." "It was disclosed 11 days ago, Your Honor," Harold Voss said calmly, "in the supplemental filing your office received. Ms. Alvarez's office confirmed receipt." Judge Voss studied both attorneys for a long moment. "Overruled. The witness may continue." Alvarado continued methodically, transfer by transfer, until the full $4.2 million had been accounted for, not in Walter Bennett's accounts, not spent on lavish vacations or hidden real estate, but in the personal holdings of Daniel Cross. "One more item, Ms. Alvarado," Harold Voss added. "Did your records show any other unusual withdrawal tied to Mr. Cross around the time the original discrepancy was first flagged internally?" "They did," Alvarado said. "A $4,000 cash withdrawal made by Daniel Cross the same week a company bookkeeper named Peter Doyle vacated his apartment and stopped reporting to work." Grace felt something cold settle in her chest. Peter Doyle hadn't run from guilt. He'd been paid to disappear before he could tell her what he'd found. Grace turned in her seat and looked directly at Daniel. For the first time since the trial began, he looked back at her, and what she saw in his eyes wasn't confusion, it was fear. The recess that followed was 15 minutes of chaos. Reporters who had been quietly covering a modest local embezzlement case suddenly realized they were sitting on something much larger. Denise Alvarez huddled with Grace in a side conference room, flipping frantically through her files. "He never told me," Grace said, staring at nothing. "Daniel never told me any of this." "Your father's attorney clearly had this evidence for over a week," Alvarez said, and structured his entire defense around a single witness reveal. "That's either brilliant lawyering or my father knew exactly what was in that account the entire time," Grace finished, "and let me file a lawsuit against him instead of just telling me the truth." "Why would he do that?" Grace didn't have an answer, not yet. When the court reconvened, Judge Voss called for the defense to present its next witness, and Harold Voss rose with a quiet gravity that silenced the room before he even spoke. "The defense calls Walter Bennett." Grace watched her father walk to the stand. He moved slower than she remembered, his hand resting briefly on the back of the witness chair before he lowered himself into it. He was sworn in. He folded his hands. "Mr. Bennett," Harold began gently, "why did you allow your daughter and this court to believe that you were responsible for these missing funds?" Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he looked past his attorney, past the judge, directly at Grace. "6 years ago," he said, "I found out that my son-in-law, Mark, had falsified safety inspection reports at the mill to save the company money on equipment repairs. Real money. Repairs that would have cost $800,000. Reports that, if they'd ever come to light, would have destroyed this company, put 200 people out of work, and very likely sent Grace to prison alongside him because her signature was on the compliance filings she trusted him to prepare honestly." The gallery went utterly silent. Grace's chest seized. Mark, her husband, dead, 3 years now, of a heart attack in this very city, and she had spent every day since remembering him as a good man who loved his daughters and coached Little League on weekends. 3 years since he'd died, still believing he'd buried that secret for good. "Mark came to me," Walter continued, his voice thickening, terrified, begging me not to tell Grace. "He said he'd fix it quietly, replace the equipment before an inspection caught it. I agreed to help him, God forgive me, because I couldn't stand the thought of my daughter losing her husband to prison, or her company, or her reputation. We fixed the equipment ourselves, off the books, using company reserve funds. I thought it was over." He stopped. His hands trembled slightly on the railing of the witness stand. "Then Mark died, and 2 years after that, Daniel Cross came to my house." "What did Daniel Cross want?" Harold asked quietly. "He'd found the old repair records," Walter said. "The falsified inspections, the off-book equipment purchase, all of it. Buried in an old server backup nobody had touched in years. He told me if I didn't authorize transfers into an account he controlled, he would take that evidence to the district attorney and to the press, and he would make sure it destroyed Grace's reputation along with Mark's memory. He said no one would believe Mark acted alone. He said they'd come after Grace next." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "So I paid him," Walter said, his voice breaking now, tears finally falling freely down his weathered face. 11 times, over 14 months, using my own authorization because I couldn't risk anyone else in the company seeing those transfers and asking questions. I let my daughter believe I was a thief. I let this whole town believe I betrayed everyone who ever trusted me, because the alternative was watching Grace lose everything: her husband's memory, her company, maybe her freedom over something Mark did, trying to protect all of us in the first place." He looked at Grace, tears streaming freely now. "I would do it again," he said. "I would let the whole world call me a thief 100 times over before I let anyone touch you." For a long moment, no one in the courtroom moved. Then Grace stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking. "May I approach?" Judge Voss allowed a brief, unusual recess for what she called a matter of judicial discretion in the interest of the proceedings. Grace crossed the well of the courtroom and stood in front of the witness stand, in front of her father, in front of everyone. "Why didn't you just tell me?" she whispered. "I would have gone to the police. I would have protected you. We could have stopped Daniel together before it ever got this far." "Because you would have felt responsible for Mark's mistake," Walter said, "and I couldn't let you carry that, not on top of losing him." Grace closed her eyes. Behind her, she could hear Daniel Cross shifting in his seat, could feel the eyes of the entire gallery, the reporters, the retired mill workers whose pensions had hung in the balance this entire time. I filed a lawsuit against my own father, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. I let this become public because I believed you'd stolen from people who trusted you your entire life. You did the right thing with the information you had, Walter said. That's not a failure, Grace. That's integrity. The final phase of the trial moved quickly after that. Denise Alvarez, now representing a plaintiff whose true adversary was clearly Daniel Cross and not Walter Bennett, worked with Harold Voss rather than against him. Daniel Cross was recalled to the stand under subpoena, and under cross-examination, his composure finally cracked. Mr. Cross, Alvarez said, her voice like a blade now, can you explain to this court why your personal bank account received $4.2 million in structured transfers from a shell company registered to Walter Bennett? Daniel Cross's lawyer, a young associate clearly out of his depth, objected twice, both overruled. I was owed that money, Daniel finally said, his voice cracking. 19 years I built that company alongside Walter and Diane Bennett. 19 years. And when Diane died, I was passed over for any ownership stake, any partnership. Grace took over instead. He stopped, jaw tightening, as if the next part cost him something to say out loud. Diane used to tell me I'd run that mill someday, he said. She said it every year at the Christmas party in front of everyone. And then she got sick and died, and Walter handed the company to his daughter, like 19 years standing next to him meant nothing. I told myself for 2 years that I'd let it go. I told myself I was still loyal, but it sat in me like rot. Then I found those old inspection records by accident, going through a server nobody had touched since Mark died, and I realized I finally had a way to take what I believed I'd already earned. So you extorted a grieving widower, Alvarez said, using the memory of his dead son-in-law to steal from the very company you claim to have loved. I told myself it wasn't stealing, Daniel said quietly. I told myself it was overdue. And Peter Doyle? Alvarez pressed. The bookkeeper you paid to vanish the moment he got close to the truth. Was that overdue too? Daniel Cross said nothing. His silence this time was its own confession. Judge Eleanor Voss delivered her ruling on a grey Thursday afternoon, the courtroom packed to capacity, reporters lining the back wall, retired mill workers filling nearly every remaining seat. This court finds, she said, that the defendant, Walter Bennett, while technically responsible for the unauthorized transfer of company funds, acted under sustained criminal extortion and did not personally benefit from a single dollar of the funds in question. This court dismisses all charges against Walter Bennett with prejudice. A wave of relief and quiet weeping moved through the gallery. This court further refers the matter of Daniel Cross to the district attorney's office for prosecution on charges of extortion, wire fraud, and grand theft, and issues a civil judgment ordering the full recovery of $4.2 million, plus damages, from all traceable Cross-family assets. The gavel came down. It was over. Outside the courthouse, on the wide stone steps overlooking the Willamette River, Grace found her father sitting alone, his tweed jacket draped over his shoulders against the autumn wind. She sat down beside him, the way she used to as a little girl, waiting for him after long days at the mill. "I'm sorry," she said. "For every night I sat awake wondering if I ever really knew you." "You knew me," Walter said. "You just didn't know what I was carrying. Why didn't you tell me about Mark? Even before Daniel, even years ago." Walter was quiet for a long moment, watching the river. "Because some fathers protect their children with strength," he finally said, "and some of us only know how to protect with silence. I got that wrong. I see that now. I thought I was sparing you pain. All I did was hand you a different kind." Grace reached over and took his hand. The same hand that had signed 100 paychecks over 30 years. The same hand that had walked her down the aisle. The same hand that had, in the end, chosen to be called a thief, rather than let his daughter carry a burden that was never hers to bear. "No more silence," she said. Walter nodded, his eyes wet. "No more carrying it alone, either of us." Behind them, the mill workers were already gathering near the courthouse doors, calling out to Walter Bennett, not with anger now, but with something close to reverence, the way people speak to someone they misjudged and are grateful to have gotten wrong. Walter Bennett stood slowly, steadied himself on his daughter's arm, and walked back toward the people who had trusted him for 30 years, the same people who, for a handful of terrible weeks, had believed the worst, and who now understood that the truest kind of love sometimes wears the face of guilt until the day the whole truth finally comes home.